fits this. Social learning theory by Albert Bandura basically says that people learn by copying those that they're intellectually attracted to. Right? Now here's the weird part about this. What if the person that you're intellectually attracted to is, you know, a bank robber or a gang member? Happens all the time, right? Why am I bringing this up? We're socially learning what races we are as well, right? We're picking people in our subgroup that we find charismatic, and we're saying, okay, I want to be like that person. That person looks like me. What if the person doesn't look like you? Social, right? You get socially ostracized again. Every learning theory supports it. So what I do in the book is I talk about this. I mean, I give example after example of how we actually learn this actual idea. And I want to get to something Ray brought up, which is a great point. So where does racism come from? Because race and racism are two different things. And if race is an idea, where does the idea come from? So I started doing even more research, and I came across this really interesting concept called scientific racism. So many books written about this, right? 1767, you had this guy named Linnaeus, right? And Linnaeus decides to come up with what he calls racial taxonomies, where I'm going to put people in specific categories, right, based on how they look, which we know is the worst way to try to, you know, define what any person is. And that's like the beginning of this whole concept of codifying where people fall in, right? On a scientific basis. Now, it's a pseudoscience, of course. It's not real. You can't prove it. It wouldn't work today, right? Because you would test it and you'd say this thing is not real. But at that particular time, people bought into it, right? And now, if you look at these taxonomies, who's at the top of the food chain and who's at the bottom? Well, it's based on physical features. And the less European your features were, the lower you were on the taxonomy. Right? So these stereotypes that we have today, that's where this stuff comes from. Because have you ever stopped and thought about, well, why do I believe that? And why do I have that stereotype? Well, if you ask yourself that question, you know that it comes from these pseudosciences that were at one time accepted. There's another theory called trait theory. And that theory says, are leaders born or are leaders made? And trait theory says that leaders are in fact born. Right? But that's a problem. Here you are again with this notion of genetics determining someone's ability to lead. So your last name is the thing that determines your leadership skills. It can't be right. I mean, what is a born leader? Do they come out the womb with, like, I don't know, a pink glow around them? I'm the leader. How do you prove it? How do you quantify it? Right? Cesar Lombroso starts to further codify these ideas later, and in criminal justice, folks know your criminal justice major, right, from the early class, criminality is inherited. Criminality is inherited. So criminals look a certain way. And he comes up with all these charts and graphs, and he shows you that certain criminals have certain features. And today we're like, come on, are you serious? But at that particular time, it was accepted, right? How about this one for all the ladies in the room? Great man theory. See the woman clenching her fist. Great man theory? Yes. 1800s, right? People that are successful are masculine. Men have the genetic traits to be successful, right? Again, this genetic link between who is successful, who's attractive, and who's going to do well, as opposed to people on the other side of the spectrum. 1770s, craniometry, where people are basing things based on skull shape, which today seems so silly, but at that particular time was a codified science, and people were accepting it. Physiognomy, personality is based on appearance. Johann Levitier. So where this stuff comes from. And the residue is still floating around, even today, in our societies, causing culture morbus, getting us to think that we're so different, but we're not. In the Petri dish, we're 99% the same. A couple more things. You guys heard of eugenics before? Wow. If you study eugenics, it really talks about Sir Francis Galton, 1883. This idea that certain classes of people, based on race and genetics, are at the top of the hierarchy and others are at the bottom. And this was supported by a large part of the scientific community. I mean, not just that, the Rockefellers supported. They were sending money into eugenicists to help them do this. H.G. Wells, Winston Churchill, Woodrow Wilson, all supporting eugenics. Later on, I'm going to talk about something called reality intelligence. I mean, I don't remember hearing about that in school. Maybe that would have changed my perceptions. Maybe I would have questioned some things about race on my own. So here's what we're saying. If race is an idea and not a fact, why don't we know it? And why are we not paying attention to the fact that anything that's man-made is imperfect? Race is man-made. It's created by us to make us feel good or comfortable about where we are on this spectrum. Here's what I write in my book. Race is a man-made construct trapped within the convoluted confines of our own minds. It leans against our id, rests atop our ego, and loiters alongside our superego, a mere figment of our chronological, historical, and social imaginations. Culture is what we need to pay attention to. In class today, we had an interesting discussion with the students, and I was thinking, if you draw a box on a board, most of us want to stay within this box. Don't talk to me about race. I know what race is. That makes my head hurt. I want to be where I'm at, right? But life doesn't happen inside the box. The cool stuff happens outside the box. I was visiting with the Native American students. I'm glad to see you come in. And they were just blowing my mind with things I didn't know about Native American culture, rising my level of cultural intelligence. And Bonnie's like, we gotta go. And I was like, I wanna stay here. I mean, just amazing things these guys were talking about. And I was like, there's a lot of similarities between African American culture and Native American culture, right? So that's what we need to do. We need to constantly be raising our cultural intelligence and challenging ourselves to understand what race actually is. Now, here's the terms that I want to lay out. The first term we talked about is called culture morbus, and we talked about that, social disease, right? This 1%. The second one that I want to talk about is called the master narrative. The master narrative. Now, the master narrative was, I don't know if he should be given complete credit for it, but I remember reading about this in a guy named Ronald Takaki, Dr. Ronald Takaki's book, and he started to talk about, here's how he explained in his book. He said he got into a cab. And this guy he's of Pacific Islander descent, right? But he was born in like Cleveland or something. You know what I mean? He's from the United States. He gets in a cab, and while he's in this cab, the guy that's driving the cab looks back and says, hey, how you doing? And Takagi is, oh, hey, how are you doing? I want to go to, so-and-so. And he goes, that's great. How long you been in the United States? Takaki's like, what? I'm a college professor. I think he's at UCLA or something like that. He's like, yeah, how long you been here? And Takaki's like, what do you mean? I was born in the United States. And his wheels are spinning. Why are you assuming I'm not born in the United States? And I'm an American. Why don't you know I'm an American? And what does an American look like? And, right? And he starts to codify this whole notion into, if you were to tell your own history, right? I mean, I was joking in class with you guys today. If I were to write, so I'm a little worried about writing my own life story, because it'll say, Bernard Greenway, he looked like Denzel Washington, he played ball like Michael Jordan. Right? Terry's like, come on, Bernard. Right? Why do we do that? Because we can't help it. It's this unconscious reality where we want to tell our story from this, side with a lot of light on it, right? Well, why wouldn't historians fall victim to that same type of revisionism? Of course they do. A lot of history, American history, is told from the perspective of people that were in power, right? So they're going to change the story a bit. They're going to leave out some of the most primary concepts. Now, if the master narrative is the story that's been written by those who are in power in the United States, what I talk about in my book is called the veritas narrative. And veritas is the Latin word for truth. What's the true story? What are the facts, right? I do a lot of reading, and I read a great book, if there's any readers out there. It's a book called The Hemingses of Monticello. And this book talks about Thomas Jefferson. I love presidential history, and I like Thomas Jefferson, so I'm like, I'm going to read this book. Halfway in, I'm like, this is not really about Thomas Jefferson. This is about a woman named Sally Hemings, right? And Sally Hemings was, if I remember, I know he was actually Thomas Jefferson's slave, and they describe her as a beautiful woman on the Monticello plantation, and she was of mixed descent, African American and white, right? And Thomas Jefferson was in his 40s or something like that, and she was like 14, and she had his children, right? So my daughter, the pretty little girl in the front, we're at her school, and she's like, Daddy, let's go. It was parent day. She's like, I want to do math. I was like, I don't do math. Let's do something else. She's like, oh, okay, oh, presidents or history? And I'm like, yes, that sounds good. And she's like, let's do presidents. Let's do Thomas Jefferson. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's gonna be great. I just read this book. She's gonna think I'm so smart, right? She's like, what number president? I tell her, and where is he from? And I tell her, and she goes, how many kids did he have? And I'm like, and my wife's like, Bernard, come on, don't. Not here. And I'm like, I gotta tell her, right? So I sit down and I start to explain to her, and she's like, oh, I guess we'll talk about that later, right? We have to, are we going to be honest about this? Are we going to put this stuff out? Why are we still perpetuating this idea that the guy only had 3 kids? One of his children was Sally Hemings. The other one was a famous chef, right? And we actually went to Monticello. Remember that? We went to Monticello, and the guide comes out, and I'm all excited, and my wife's like, calm down. It's not Disney World. It's Monticello. I'm like, so cool. And the guide comes out, if you remember, and he starts to say, he goes through the whole historical thing, and I'm listening, and I'm like, he's done, and I'm like, he didn't say anything about Sally Hemings. So you know me. About Sally Hemings. And he's like, oh yeah, Sally Hemings, and he's telling it. And I'm like, well, where was that? Why are we constantly running away from historical truths? As if those things are gonna make us better? We need to get to the Veritas narrative. What is true? Let's look, Thomas Jefferson still wrote the Declaration of Independence. The guy was incredibly gifted. I'm not gonna say I respect him more, but I understand his story in more complexity now, because I see the humanity of this guy, as opposed to the lionized version, right? Reality, intelligence, and the Veritas narrative. The other term is culture sanus. If culture morbus is the social disease that makes all of us recoil back to our groups, culture sanus is where we should be at. Sanus is the Latin word for health. We need to get culturally healthy. We need to understand the truth about our cultures and recognize the beauty in them and get outside the box, right? And do things that increase our levels of cultural intelligence as much as we possibly can. It's gonna make us better everything, managers, citizens, everything across the proverbial board. Last thing I wanna say is a lot of problems, I think, when we look at issues of race is there's no set plan. It's like, okay, so interesting things about race, but what do we do with that? And the person just leaves you hanging. There's no practical application. Here's my theory. How do we get to culture sanus? I teach management classes, and one thing that we talk about all the time is this whole idea of organizational change, right? And all the textbooks say, if you want your organizations to change in a successful manner, you have to change 4 basic guide points: people, structures, technologies, and philosophies. And I thought, you know what? That's how we need to attack this culture morbus problem. Think of it in terms of organized social change. This movement, I call it the myriad movement, getting everybody to constantly pay attention to what is similar about them. And most of it is 99% similar. I mean, any sport, right? Terry, you shoot 99% from the line, that's pretty good, right? I mean, you can't do better than that. Why are we so quick to say, yeah, but I don't know, I'm not like that person? Well, because we're still affected by scientific racism. It's still whispering in our ears, forcing us to recoil back to our own places. People, what do we have to do? Action plan. We have to relearn history and what the